Previously on the British Broadcasting Century podcast. It's summer 1923, and the BBC has ballooned in size and scope. The month of June has seen the BBC's first programme of musical criticism from Percy Scholes, a new deputy boss in Admiral Carpendale, The Merchant of Venice, OBs in Wales, a symphony concert, and beyond the Beeb, John Logie Baird is advertising for help with his seeing by wireless invention. Television? Ha! No future in it. Well, not yet, but this time, still in radio days, we move to July of 1923, a month of pop-up stations from Plymouth, more Shakespeare, and a wireless manhunt on the air, akin to the Radio 1 giant DJ hunts that Greg James goes on once a year in the present day. Oh, I do love the wireless manhunt story. This is one of my favourites of early broadcasting, and I think you will love it too. And we've got a couple of guests who love the wireless manhunt so much they've joined us to talk about it, and other ways that radio can go above and beyond to connect with listeners. So our two guests this time, familiar voices to the podcast, our newspaper detective Andrew Barker.
During the early summer of 1923, listeners were getting rather bored with the BBC. They were finding that really there were only three types of programme. There was the news, there were concerts and talk. And what the BBC needed was something that would excite listeners and something that would excite the press. And this is one of the first instances of the BBC making a stunt broadcast.
And author of the book Radiophilia, The Return of Dr. Carolyn Birdall.
When you look at 100 years of radio, and as you are also looking with the podcast, you do start to look at certain parallels or similarities or connections between this early moment of the early 1920s and more recent decades. So we often think that a lot of the things, liking, sharing, participatory media, interactive fandom, we think of them as being typical of the period since the expansion of the internet, and especially since the smartphone and social media platforms. And I guess one of the insights I had while researching this book is just how much this early period of the 1920s is also that of the growth of what we would call an interactive fandom.
So what is a wireless manhunt then? Well, you'll have to catch me to find out. Or I will tell you on episode 94 of the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is London Calling.
Well, hello. Thank you for joining us, listeners in Etherians, Comradios. More on those particular titles for those who are listening, and the early BBC's quest to work out what to call its own listeners. Later on this podcast, we'll delve into that. It's November 2024 at time of recording. We're a little slow on the pod production line at the moment still, nearer once a month than any more frequent than that. And that's partly thanks to my family's annus horribilis of medical mayhem, and I thank you for your continued good wishes. I will take them as read. Things are improving now, thank you. But as this is a solo-run podcast, we are nothing to do with the BBC, I'm sure you know by now. It does mean if a cog falls off this machine, the machine slows down. And this year, I've had a couple of cogs fall off my machine of life. So the podcast production line has just slowed a little, but we're not that slow. I mean, one podcast a month or so, that's not that bad, is it? Given the amount of research, the marvellous guests, and everything else that goes into this podcast project. So thank you, not just for your patience, but if you support us on Patreon. We've had a new Patreoner join us this month. Doesn't happen every month, so hello Helen, thank you for being part of the gang who support this podcast. £5 a month is all it takes. You get extra behind the scenesy things and videos and writings as well. And what's that, £1 a week? It just helps support the podcast, keeps us afloat, pays for our online hosting and the occasional research book. I've just bought another one. Don't tell my wife, but a new book arrives in the post any moment on broadcasting history. And all of that can happen thanks to those who chip in. We'll be thanking our patrons by name this episode. We don't do it all the time, but we do it now and then just to give them a name check. So that'll be end of this episode. We'll do that as part of the credits, I think. We have 29 patrons so far. Could you be our 30th? I know that not many podcasts actually announce how many patrons we have. We are proud of our delightfully small but hearty tribe. So thank you to our 29 people who chip in each month. The other thing slowing down my podcasting is my workload. I'm a present-day BBCer as well as delving into ye old BBC. So that means at the minute I'm writing for Not Going Out, Lee Mack's sitcom. I've been co-writing that with Lee and a few others since season 1, and we're now on season 14. I'm as amazed as anybody. We're underway with that now. I'm also doing religious broadcasting for the BBC. I don't think many people write sitcoms and do religious broadcasts, but hey, you've got to plough your niche, haven't you, if that's the thing you do. Do you plough niches? You furrow your niches, you plough your fields and scatter. I can't work it out. Anyway, I'm doing some daily services for Radio 4 Extra, Pause for Thoughts for Radio 2 now and then, and that's all very nice indeed. I've also been gigging, of course, touring the land with both stand-up and my favourite one-man show that I've ever toured, An Evening of Very Old Radio. It's about my 10th or 12th one-man show I've toured over the last 20 years or so, and it is definitely my favourite. You shouldn't have favourites, but I think you can when it comes to stage shows you've performed. The stage show, An Evening of Very Old Radio, is basically this podcast condensed into 90 minutes, live with Q&As and props and the like. paulcarenza.com/tour. That tells you where and when I am near you. The upcomings include Faversham, Mayfield in Sussex, Bath Abbey. That will be lovely. Do come to Bath Abbey if you're near Bath. Gloucestershire, Shropshire, and many, many less. Anyway, enough about present day and 2024 into 2025-ness. What about July of 1923? A month of film criticism, Shakespeare, and an innovative radio manhunt whose echoes still reverberate on Radio 1 today. But first, let's begin with how the month began. There was a pop-up Plymouth radio station that somehow is a rival to the BBC. Delighted to welcome now back to the podcast. His fingerprints are all over the podcast every episode, whether he's on it or not. And that is our newspaper detective, Andrew Barker. Thanks for joining us, Andrew. This story that we wouldn't know about at all, which is why we have to speak to you about this, because I don't think anyone else in the country knows much about Plymouth 5DJ, do they?
No, indeed. There are very few references to it. There are a few of these stations which are providing a sort of broadcast service even while the BBC was broadcasting in 1923. You'll know about 2MT Rickle, which has been mentioned many times in the past, which was a non-BBC station which overlapped a bit. There was 2BP, which was a special station at the Glasgow Motor Show in sort of January, February. There was a station called 5MG, which was like a precursor to the to 5SC, which was the BBC Glasgow station, which broadcast for a while and actually was partially supported by the BBC. There was a Sheffield experimental station, which has not yet been covered on the podcast, but I'm sure will be at some point in the future. And there's the smallest of those experimental stations, 5DJ.
Wireless concert, transmission test at Plymouth. So said the Western Evening Herald on the 1st of July 1923. The station is the first transmitting station in Plymouth to attempt experimental broadcasting of such a character.
Now, 5DJ was an experimental station run by a couple of wireless amateurs who were members of the Plymouth Wireless and Scientific Society.
Experiments in the transmission of wireless telephony, which Messrs R. Eves and G.E. Prance are carrying out at Plymouth, entered upon a new and ambitious phase last evening when an attempt was made to broadcast an entertainment by the Dons concert party.
The first mention of it in the press is sort of around about the 30th or 29th of June 1923. And it had been carrying on for some time, and we don't know how long it had been carrying on for, but it had been broadcasting outside the normal broadcast BBC time. So it would broadcast on a Wednesday from 11 p.m, on a Sunday from 10:30 p.m, and on Friday afternoon between 4 and 5 p.m. And you get the impression from reading these news reports that these two amateurs really didn't have much money, because the valve that broke cost £2.10, and they didn't have a spare. Possibly the biggest thing they did at that point was they broadcast an entertainment by a concert party.
Mr. H.A. Blackburn announced the items. The members of the party, 2 ladies and 4 gentlemen, found their performance in front of the unenthusiastic mouth of the microphone exacting. They made the almost unavoidable mistake of standing too near the microphone during their opening numbers, but this was easily rectified. The transmission then proceeded excellently.
A couple of people who responded to the broadcast, because they were asked to send in reception reports. During that same broadcast, Mr. Prance said that he was disappointed about the scarcity of reports upon their experiments.
If we do not receive a dozen reports upon the reception of this concert, there will be no transmission next Sunday, he said.
So they did receive 2 reports, which isn't anything like a dozen.
One report was received during the programme of the test from Mr. P.M. Fowler, Secretary of Plymouth Wireless and Scientific Society, who listened in from his house on the Hoe and reported excellent results. His only complaint was that the artiste spoke their lines too rapidly, making it difficult to follow the words, and the hint was acted upon. The DJ of the 5DJ station call sign is indeed coincidence. There was no such thing as a DJ back in 1923. We'll come back to this 5DJ Plymouth pop-up station later on this podcast, but that's what was happening on the weekend of the end of June, going into the start of July. The Sunday, the 1st of July, back on the Beeb. It's the first Sunday afternoon concert at the London station. So said Sunday Pictorial. Thanks, of course, to the aforeheard Andrew Barker, our newspaper detective, for finding this and all of the newspaper snippets that we bring you. This snippet continues with details of what you would hear at 3 p.m. for London's first Sunday afternoon concert. Ah, yes, not just religion or silence on the air this time, not when you could hear Vladimov's Balalaika Orchestra, Miss Kate Winter, soprano, Mr. Sheridan Russell, solo violoncello, and Mr. William E. Hallman, dramatic impersonator. What dramatics he was impersonating, I do not know. Meanwhile, in Cardiff, let's dart around the country. Yes, that maverick station director, Major Arthur Corbett Smith, had been asking listeners in what they would like to be called on air, apart from listeners in. And on 4th of July 1923, Wireless Weekly magazine collated a few suggestions. An award of a guinea was offered for the best. The competition attracted a large number of suggestions, among them being Hello Radio Everybody, or Ethonians, or My Ether Friends, Etherians, and Radiophils. The prize was, however, awarded this weekend to Mr. J. W. Aspinall Gransden, Parabello Road, Cheltenham, who suggested Comradios. To Mr. Cecil Smith of Earl Farm, Compton, Somerset, who sent in the same suggestion a few days later, a consolation prize has been awarded. Ah yes, Comradios the winner. A play on comrades and radios. But did you also hear radiophils in there, with a PH, and an IA at the end? You get Radiophilia, which happens to be the book by one of our guests this episode. The Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Amsterdam is Dr. Carolyn Birdall, and I invited her on to talk about the Wireless Manhunt. And I asked Dr. Carolyn Birdall about how these radiophiles, comradios, listeners in, whatever you'd like to call them, how do they interact with the broadcasters? Or at least, how did they perceive they were interacting?
All kinds of things we see happening in radio, like contests, quizzes, letter writing to stations, song requests to stations. This has been called in the research literature a perceived interactivity. Not all letters are read out. And I think it's something that when we have this old and new media distinction, we sometimes forget that these kinds of dynamics were happening at the time.
I remember reading in, I think it's David Lloyd's book on radio broadcasting, he talks about how in the English language, the singular and plural version of you is really useful for broadcasters, because you can say, up next, you on the phone, you phone now, you will get through, you will get on. And often they can be talking about you plural, but actually it sounds like you singular, and we think they're talking to us about us. But of course, we know my song won't necessarily get on next, but they can say yours, they're correct, someone's song will get on next. And it feels personal. It's a one-to-one relationship. Although also I was looking into some of those very early radio demonstrations, not demonstrations indeed, but when a community would gather in a hall to listen to radio as if it's a theatrical event. And that feels really odd, because I think of radio as something I might listen to in the car with my family, but really it's about me and the broadcaster, and not me and 100 other people listening. That's a very different sort of relationship with radio, I suppose.
Absolutely. And I think that also says something about the privatized forms of media consumption that we in the last decades have become used to. The Walkman, the car radio, headset-based music consumption. I think it is hard for us to imagine even the classic hearth scenario of the family gathered around the living room in the 1920s, or as you said, communities where there's a sharing of radio, where radio sets were put on the windowsill so that neighbors could also share, organized listening sessions, cafes and restaurants, train compartments, through to more state-led installation of radio loudspeakers in public squares and educational context. So I think we forget that that's part of the early experience of radio, is that not everyone could afford their own set. and that they often came together with neighbors, with friends in other settings where they had access to the technology.
More from Dr. Carolyn Birdall later this episode, when the BBC of 1923 sends its most loved presenters out on the run. Will they be found by the listeners in, the radiophiles, the ethonians, the comradios? Well, first, it's time for another full-length Shakespeare on the Beeb, because 5th of July, it's Romeo and Juliet. The balcony scene on its own was done on Shakespeare's birthday, 23rd of April, on the Cardiff station, yes indeed, by Major Arthur Corbett Smith, as Romeo. Yep, the station boss took the romantic lead. Of course he did. Can you imagine the head of a BBC station today popping on the air to portray Romeo and then going back to running the station? Nope, me neither. Juliet was played on that occasion by Miss Marjorie Unnett, who, to my knowledge, didn't run any of the BBC stations. No, she was an actress. Can you believe they got an actress to play alongside a station director? Weird. Birmingham 5IT had done the same scene the same night for Shakespeare's birthday, but now it's the 5th of July, and it's not just a balcony scene, it's the full play, under the direction and adaptation of, as ever, Kathleen Nesbitt. Do see our previous episodes on the first BBC Shakespeares with Dr. Andrea Smith for more on the wonderful Kathleen Nesbitt. Elsewhere that same day, 5th of July, Engineering Department were testing simultaneous broadcasting, having a few issues with its quality. That'll be ironed out, and we will tell you more about simultaneous broadcasting, SB, when we cover its launch in August of 1923. Next day, 6th of July 23, back in Plymouth, and 5DJ, that pop-up station, has closed. They did say that if people didn't get back to them, they might do that, and they were good on their word. Andrew Barker.
There is an article in the Western Morning News, 5DJ to close down.
This fact will be learned with considerable regret by a large body of amateurs in the district, but it's solely owing to their apathetic acceptance of the good things provided by the energy of others that the interesting items sent out from the station at intervals are now to cease.
The problem with the station was that it's a coastal station, and the station was having a lot of interference from ships. The ships at that time, most of the ships, the maritime broadcasts, were using spark radio, which effectively obliterated pretty much all the broadcast band. And it was very difficult to receive BBC stations in a place like Plymouth, where the nearest one would have been either Cardiff or London.
The last straw is the fact that following on Sunday's transmissions of a concert given by the Dons concert party, only 2 reports were received from listeners in, a lack of interest which has greatly disappointed the experimenters, who feel that it's not worth carrying on in the face of such a meagre response to their appeal for information on which to base future tests.
And so the Wireless Society was wanting and asking the BBC, can we have a relay station? In some sense, 5DJ was doing the experimentation on that basis to see how far they could get reception and so on, although it didn't have any real link itself with the BBC. And then we have it in abeyance for a while, nothing much happening, until on the 11th of August, the Western Mail says 5DJ returns. So they closed and they restarted some transmissions. The previous Thursday, there was a short talk on broadcasting, and the following night, there was plans to transmit from the station on the 12th of August 1923. And then later on in the week, short stories and humorous anecdotes. The one on the Sunday had a lecture on broadcasting and an arithmetical poser, which listeners were invited to solve. And there were 2 correct solutions that were sent into the station. They were going to transmit on the 26th of August, and then the station goes silent. There's nothing else reported about this 5DJ from that point on. So it lived less than 2 months.
Wow. Is this pirate? Is this allowed? Is it breaking the law, or is it sort of...
It was allowed. Amateurs at that time could actually broadcast, but they were advised to broadcast outside the times that the radio stations were on. So they would be broadcasting after 11 o'clock at night, or at times during Sunday when the BBC wasn't broadcasting on any station.
And one assumes as well, maybe, that they got away with it a little bit for that summer, partly because that's a bit of a blind spot in broadcasting in the southwest. Devon and Cornwall, BBC hadn't got there yet. So the Plymouth radio station of 5PY comes along soon after that.
I think that the BBC weren't particularly chasing the amateurs at this point. people were still broadcasting, and as long as they didn't cause any interference to the BBC broadcasts, the BBC would leave them alone. But obviously, if an amateur was broadcasting and causing interference, then Peter Eckersley was not happy at all.
Well, what else elsewhere then? Captain Eckersley has had his work cut out. Some listeners do want him to do less engineering, more broadcasting. When Captain P.P. Eckersley left his famous little home in the east, Writtle, subsequently to 2 Emmetock's final and deeply regretted closing down, and joined the BBC, we all had great hopes that we should frequently hear his cheery voice through Tuello's microphone. Popular Wireless on the 7th of July. Possibly the worthy captain is too busily engaged in the engineering side of the business. Remember, he is chief engineer. No light task when 8 or so large examples of a new science are to be watched and wangled. But it does seem surprising that he does not appear just a little more often as an uncle. How the kiddies would love him. Well, indeed, as that correspondent noted, Peter Eckersley was rather busy. The BBC still isn't quite national yet, and he has to make it so. So 2 days later, Peter Eckersley was in Sheffield, and to explain why, here is the man himself.
A gentleman from Sheffield, Mr. Lloyd, walked into my office. He didn't knock, and he came straight in and he said, "Have you listened to Wireless in Sheffield?" So I said, "Frightfully sorry, no, I haven't actually." He said, "Well, it's like an insurrection in hell." In other words, there was a good deal of interference with reception. And from that sprang the relay station.
So 9th of July, PPE went to Sheffield to address a public meeting on the Sheffield relay station. Members of the public and representatives of companies who manufacture wireless apparatus will be invited for the purpose of expressing their views and opinions on the matter. This, as the Northern Daily Mail said the next day, would be the first of the kingdom which picks up and retransmits broadcasting sent out by other stations. Yes, this is the first relay station, the brainchild of Peter Eckersley. It underwent its first official test yesterday with very satisfactory results. Oh yes, he didn't hang about. Elsewhere geographically, day after that, 11th July 1923, and there's news of a new studio in Birmingham, according to Wireless Weekly. It's to be in New Street, right in the heart of the city. If it goes well, be opened on August the 7th. Arrangements are now being proceeded with for the perfection of the new studio on lines similar to that at London. The ceiling and walls are to be heavily draped so that undesirable resonance effects will be entirely eliminated. In addition to the studio itself, there'll be a reception room, a couple of offices. It's worth noting that the studio is within a few hundred yards of the city's leading theatres, hotels and railway stations, so every facility will be offered to artistes and others who may contribute to the programmes. Connecting the BBC with the city's culture. Well, same day on the air, that is something that was being done by Mr. G.A. Atkinson. He's the BBC's first film critic, and he has a new programme, Seen on the Screen. The Barry Norman of his day. There are sadly no clips anywhere of Mr. G.A. Atkinson, but we have a lot of his words. Because Mr. Atkinson began as a journalist in 1903, he wrote film reviews for the Daily Express, and it's through that he was hired by the BBC as their first film critic in July of 1923. Throughout the 1920s, Mr. Atkinson presented this 15-minute programme every other Friday, 7 p.m. He was a bit down on British films. They go to see American stars. They talk America, think America, and dream America. Our homegrown efforts were, in Atkinson's opinion, seen as foreign language films even by British audiences who were used to what Hollywood was offering. This is before talkies had even begun. And 2 days after the BBC's first film show, it's the 13th of July 23, and it's time, at last, for this iconic moment on the air, one of the biggest and boldest enterprises that early broadcasting had embarked on. Ladies and gents, the Wireless Manhunt. To explain more, here's the man who has scoured the newspapers of the day, Sir Andrew Barker. Yes, I have just knighted him for services to broadcasting history.
During the early summer of 1923, the public sort of got used to the BBC. There was a lot of anti-BBC press. Wireless dealers were going bust because the BBC wasn't really pulling in many new listeners at that point. Because, in part, the press were saying, "No, is the BBC going to close down?" And what the BBC needed was something that would excite listeners and something that would excite the press. So they had the idea of, let's have a manhunt.
Wireless Manhunt, London night search for thieves. The London Daily News, 14th of July 1923. The big broadcasting test of the efficacy of wireless in capturing criminals was carried out last night by the London station. The plot was that a number of criminals were supposed to have robbed a titled lady of her string of pearls while she was broadcasting at the London station. The incident happened just after 6 p.m, and at 6:45 details of the miscreants were broadcast. And they included uncles Caractacus, Jeff and Arthur, and Aunt Sophie. So that's Cecil Lewis, the Deputy Director of Programmes, Stanton Jeffrey, Musical Director, Arthur Burrows, the Director of Programmes, and Aunt Sophie is Cecile Dixon, who's the accompanist at the BBC. So they are some of the best-loved stars, and they're on the run.
There were 3 cars set off into the various areas around London, and people were asked to look out for these cars. The registration numbers of the cars were given.
Auntie Sophie and Uncle Caractacus and 2 others were stated to have made off in a Daimler car numbered HB 6256 and to have been seen in the neighbourhood of Edgware.
And if they spotted one of these cars, they were to give a thumbs up.
Uncle Jeff was said to have left in a BSA car marked HB 5873, and broadcatchers, there's another term, com radios, ethonians, listeners in, broadcatchers, were asked to look out for him within a radius of 25 miles around London, as it is a trick of his, said the broadcaster, to double on his tracks. Uncle Arthur escaped in a blue and grey 4-seater, numbered HB 5186, and it was supposed that he would keep to the streets of London.
The newspapers were reporting this, and of course it got people excited again about radio.
Broadcatchers were asked to send in details giving time and place to Mr. Tuello by Monday, and 3 prizes of £5 each will be given for the best replies. Uncle Arthur told the Daily News late last night he thought he was recognised within 15 minutes. The radio detectives, he said, were told to hold up a thumb to us if they recognised us, and at least 3 people did so to me in the course of a 50-mile tour around London streets. 3 people in 50 miles. Just saying.
Popular Wireless states that Uncle Jeff seemed to have the most exciting time. He was travelling along the Edgware Road at a good 40 miles an hour. He was stopped by a policeman for exceeding the speed limit. Once he told the policeman what he was doing, he told him to run along with a wink and said, "You are one of the BBC's criminals." So even the policeman knew about it. So there are things like that. Another tale that is told, Uncle Jeff again, he went into a pub for a drink, ordered a ginger beer, quick, at the bar, and told the barmaid that he was running away from the police, having stolen a pearl necklace. The maid threw up her hands in horror. "Law, sir, have you really? Here, take a drink and hop it." So that's Uncle Jeff during that.
We were also tipped off about this by Alan Stafford. Hello, Alan. Thanks for being in touch once again.
Alan has a new book out on the first radio comedy star John Henry. Bigamy Killed the Radio Star. Available now.
He noted that prize winners included a young lad who chased one of the cars on his bike for half an hour until the chain broke, and an army major who brilliantly put his wife and kids in his car, planned the pursuit as a military exercise.
There was another wireless hunt that took place the following year. And so this has obviously proved popular, and there were separate wireless hunts for every station on the same evening, July 26th. 1924. The Glasgow Manhunt, it says a considerable number of trackers gathered outside the studio in Bath Street, expecting the hunt to start from there. Well, it didn't actually start from the studio, because obviously they were hoping they could catch the fugitives, so they were thwarted. There's another article in the Birmingham Weekly News about the Birmingham station's manhunt, about how hundreds of motorists were puzzled because people were giving thumbs up to them, trying to identify people. And one of them says, "Every time we slowed down for traffic or passed a knot of people, some either gibbering ass would spring at us with the same ridiculous movement as if thumbs, and usually yelling, 'I got you.'" That was just a normal motorist and not a BBC person. We have another one from Sunderland. A provisional policeman apparently misunderstood his instruction and was under the impression that he was on the track of a number of real criminals. He was successful in identifying the car, and at some risk boarded another car and gave chase and attempted to arrest his quarry. Now, I don't know which station that was for. It was reported by the Sunderland Daily Echo. But oddly enough, in 2023, 100 years later, also in July, Radio 1 had their own manhunt. like the older Manhunts, with the help of listeners, given various clues and so on. And this was rather special.
Ah, yes, every summer, if you're not aware of this, Radio 1 on the BBC do a sort of a similar thing, a wireless manhunt. They've done hide and seek. They've done a giant DJ hunt where Greg James was in the studio and he implored listeners to look out for clues, maybe on social media or out and about, and he was given clues by his bosses for where all of the other DJs on Radio 1 were hiding. The deal was that Greg James had to keep on broadcasting unless he found another DJ to present with him. So potentially it could be Greg James on the air and nobody else until, over the course of 5 days, he did start finding the others. Here's Andrew Barker.
On the Thursday, the stakes got higher, and Greg was told that if he didn't complete the challenge by midday on Friday, the station would go off air. And of course, the massive publicity that gave from the press will have no doubt made lots of people listen into Radio 1 while it was going on.
Those manhunts as well, then and now, that sense of interactivity you get, listeners saying, look, don't just passively listen, actively get involved. And this is, you can help shape the broadcasts yourself then. So it's a wonderful thing.
So it sounds like you were gripped on the edge of your seat, wondering what was going to happen.
Here's Dr. Carolyn Birdall.
My understanding is that in the end, it didn't work out, and Radio 1 went dead for 5 minutes. People continued to listen to dead air, essentially, as they were trying to find the final Radio 1 DJ, Ollie King.
A remarkable thing for a station to do, not even the emergency tape that didn't kick in. In this day and age of 24-hour radio, can you imagine a station closing with dead air for 5 minutes deliberately? Incredible.
In a beautiful sort of twist of fate, I suppose, they were foiled at the last moment because of paperwork, because of a BBC health and safety form. To go and find Molly on a boat in the English Channel, Greg James had to sign paperwork, and they couldn't find a pen, they couldn't find the right form. And if it weren't for that form, then Radio 1 would have been on the air. But it was a joyous, bizarre moment to actually say, we're going to kill off this radio station just for 5 minutes. That's what's at stake here.
I think it's really interesting that at a moment when radio has been supposedly in crisis in the UK, asking, whether the younger generation is interested in consuming live-to-air content or would rather use facilities or like BBC Sounds and consume other content that's not live-to-air radio, that a program like this would be actually so incredibly engaging and gripping for its audiences and capture the imagination of the larger public. We have the 100 years of BBC, and we can actually see that the first one was probably more playful. The first Radio Manhunt, it sounds like it was a little bit of a lark, if I understand your reading of it.
I wish we had more to go on than 2 newspaper cuttings, essentially. There's very little else out there about it. I just found it bizarre that 100 years later, we're using different technology, of course, both in terms of how radio is broadcast, and we're listening via BBC Sounds or various websites and things, but also the technology of we're then trying to track them down via Twitter, particularly via Instagram. There was lots of, on the Radio 1 version, lots of this presenter has just shared an Instagram story that gives a little hint as to where they might be. And so the host in the studio would direct listeners to go and check out this Instagram post. Do you recognize which theme park that is they might be in, which castle that could be? Do you recognize the turrets, that sort of stuff? So, but then, of course, because of that, you could have a bigger scale. So they were sending people all around the British Isles.
Some DJs were found in strange places. Danny Howard and Pete Tong at Ibiza Rocks, Vic Hope in an Ann Summers shop, Rick and Melvin in Amsterdam at a Coldplay gig.
So you can go wider if you've got a bigger listenership. If you've got millions.
Absolutely.
You can go global.
And I guess part of that was also that in this early period of 1923, with the first Radio Manhunt, there wasn't yet a fully fledged national network. So they were forced to stay rather more local in this London network area. And I think some of this exploration about what is the location of our programming and what can radio do in terms of eventfulness and other qualities such as immediacy, intimacy, simultaneity, or spontaneity. These have been discussed for early radio, but those same questions are happening in the 2023 Manhunt.
So that Wireless Manhunt was on the 13th of July, and we'll check in about its prize giving, which happened a week after the event. In other broadcasting news of the day, more chronologically though, 4 days after the Manhunt, the Westminster Gazette reported on a ban. You might remember this. It was imposed by the British National Opera Company, saying that its artists could no longer work for the BBC. The concern was the broadcasters were stealing the opera's audiences. There are some notable omissions from the list of singers who are to perform at the Promenade concerts at the Queen's Hall. That's the proms to you and me. The explanation of this state of affairs may be found in the statement made by Mr. William Boosey, head of Messrs. Chappell's, some time ago, that all artists of the British National Opera Company who gave broadcast performances would be barred from appearing in future at the Queen's Hall. Amongst the names on the programme, one looks in vain for those of Miss Edna Thornton, Mr. Tudor Davis, Mr. Robert Radford and Miss Florence Austral. You must choose the beeb or the stage, but not both. Well, if that's a bit bleak over in opera land, perhaps we need some levity from the orchestra. Because the next day, 18th July, Wireless Weekly reported on an unusual quirk of comedic broadcasting. There was laughter in many wireless homes this week when listeners in to the Glasgow station experienced a novel innovation connected with the broadcasting of a series of funny stories by the editor of Titbits magazine. This is Leonard Crocombe.
There was a young fellow who was a very, very nervous young fellow.
Future first editor of the Radio Times.
And he was very much in love with a girl.
And the future grandfather of Justin Webb from today's BBC.
But he was too nervous to propose to her in the ordinary way.
Writer of humorous stories, he delivered a few on the air.
So he telephoned her up and said, I say, will you marry me?
But he found the lack of laughter to be a bit of a problem.
So she said, rather, I think I will. Who is it speaking?
And Wireless Weekly reported on his solution. It was arranged that the station orchestra should laugh heartily after each joke. Now this no doubt made the storyteller's performance easier, for it gave him breathing intervals and cheered him up, and in addition a natural atmosphere was created for listeners in throughout the country, many of whom laughed heartily through sheer infection. In this connection, we may yet observe in the daily press a situation advertised for persons of infectious laughter, references required. Ancestor of studio audience sitcoms yet to come, the orchestra chuckling on demand whenever Leonard Crocombe gave them the look. We'll bring you more on Leonard Crocombe's new magazine, the Radio Times, in about 4 episodes' time, when we reach its launch in September 1923. But back in July of 23, it's the 20th, and the Rugby Advertiser brings news of how successful the Birmingham station's children's scheme was. We were surprised to hear the Birmingham Radio Circle has a membership now of 3,500 children, all of whom wear their badges. Impressive. At the same day, the Wireless Manhunt, which had happened a week earlier, had its prize-giving ceremony. Oh yes, why stop at the hunt itself when you can drag it out to a ceremony as well a week later? Greg James, take note. The only shame is they had the prize-giving, but they couldn't play in clips of the actual manhunt because recordings didn't exist yet. The Westminster Gazette on the 21st of July 23. The criminals, a description of whom was broadcast yesterday week, and who attempted to escape from pursuit in motorcars, were all spotted by members of the public in a remarkably short time after 2LO had made known the alleged facts. 3 prizes of £5 each were presented yesterday to the winners, Mr. Fleming Williams of Letchworth, Mr. A. Trill of Moorland Road, Croydon, and Mr. C. Oughton of St Dunstan's Road, Forest Gate.
I think this kind of focus on special events or, beyond the kind of dailiness of the everyday program is something that is one of the big draw cards of radio. But here it's actually something which isn't just about listening to what happens in a sport event or participating through cheers that you hear around your neighborhood, but very actively in a kind of detective manner, looking for clues, sending in guesses. But I guess the early example is already foreshadowing what we're seeing in the later example. So all of these aspects of like how far can we go with a radio program beyond the studio, beyond the radio station, which then I think is Savoy Hill in the BBC case. Can we take cables out for our events? Can we broadcast from outdoor live events? So all of these things are being experimented in that early period around 1922, 1923 when this program took place.
Lord Gainford, chairman of the British Broadcasting Company, presided at a lunch at Simpson's in connection with the affair and declared that in future the efforts of the company would be directed not only to the amusement but also to the recreation and education of the masses of the population within their reach. So the BBC chairman then is using the prize giving for a serious point as well. They're awaiting news of the Sykes inquiry, you see. We've mentioned that on a number of episodes. For listeners in back then as well, it was rumbling on a little long. But the occasion took a fun turn as well. The dream team of Peter Eckersley, John Reith and Arthur Burrows were all gathered there at the prize giving, and there was one joyous moment after luncheon when Mr. Reith called on Captain Eckersley to give a solo on the piano. This took the form of a lifelike imitation of an Italian tenor, whose song was being interrupted by reaction themes. Met with tremendous applause on 369 metres. Just like the Riddle days. After the luncheon, the company adjourned to the steps of the BBC offices, where Lord Gainford presented the prizes to the 3 lucky amateur detectives. A Pathé Frère cinema operator recorded this momentous occasion, managed to take successful pictures, despite Captain Eckersley's humorous suggestion he should add another valve. So they've actually filmed this event, but I've looked, I can't see it anywhere. Still, maybe it's out there somewhere. Lastly, in our July 1923 whiz through, God, it's been a packed month, hasn't it? To Manchester and to 2ZY, that pioneer station that was there before the BBC. It began in May 1922 and then it became part of the BBC, carried on innovating and perfecting there in the Northwest. Now, in July 23, they decided to do a report into different musical styles for maybe different days of the week. That was one of their ideas. Something similar had been tried in Cardiff. So this report they published established that programmes were best segregated into distinct types so the public know beforehand on what night to expect programmes to suit certain tastes. They wanted a little bit more clarity on what subjects and what lectures and specialists might join the airwaves. The 2ZY report noted that children's programmes were very popular and did well when they were educational. They noted generally that their programmes were of a higher standard than American transmissions. I'm just quoting. And they also found that a weekly printed programme was of use, with photos of radio personalities, details of broadcasts and so on. This is like the Radio Times 2 months before there was a Radio Times, although that was being planned at this point. They wanted letters, feedback, opinions to generate genuine engagement with their listeners, or listeners-in, or ethonians, or comradios. Magazines of the day were a great way of generating interactive fandom. So says our guest this week, Dr. Carolyn Birdall.
The type of interactive fandom I've talked about for the early period, it's happening through print media, it's happening with magazines, newspapers, people are calling in. We can actually see that radio's effective appeal is being encouraged through magazine consumption, newspaper consumption. In a way, the letters that they write often are very personal towards announcers, as if they're having this one-on-one connection. But this dimension being encouraged by the magazines and by the stations is really quite key in the development of this effective appeal and the attachment of listeners to radio.
It's interesting thinking and then about that perceived interactivities you talk about. I know those radio programs I've heard where they say, you can tweet us, but they don't read out any tweets. And you think, okay, they're making it feel like a conversation when it isn't. Versus those like the Radio 1 DJ Hunt, they tried to engineer it almost like we need someone to get to Wells in Somerset, and they would deliberately try and find 2 different listeners coming from 2 different directions. Actually, if you get 2, then the 2 listeners can meet, and then there's a nice moment where, oh, Jane, meet Bill, oh, hi, oh, hello, and you can hear these 2 phone calls connect together, and it just creates another bit of magic, and it does feel... Of course, it's not genuine interactive for every listener, but there is the possibility we can all get involved.
Absolutely. Actually setting people into motion, that they go to a particular location and start looking across a vast area for the DJ is actually quite amazing. So the fact that, people were in Ibiza in the Netherlands looking for the DJs also attests to the fact that it was even going beyond the British Isles context. So it's really quite a phenomenal example. The scale of this event is almost, I would say, unmatched. But actually there are other examples. Like in the Netherlands, there's a program called Special Request, where the DJ spends several days in a glass box on a square somewhere in the Netherlands. And it's about fundraising. It's about watching the DJs in the booth, coming and them doing live shows for people. It's I think 4 or 5 day event, and it's kind of a hybrid digital and live event, it becomes much more expanded than in the earlier period.
And again, it all helps with the future of radio and radiophilia, I suppose, is again that ongoing connection and making sure that we still keep on loving radio.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. It's a marvellous book. Radiophilia is your book. Thank you, Dr. Carolyn Birdall, for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks, Paul.
My thanks to Dr. Carolyn Birdall. My thanks to our newspaper detective, Andrew Barker. Both marvellous guests, friends of the podcast. Delighted to have you. If you're a friend of the podcast and you've not been on it and would like to, we would value an interview with you or an audio excerpt. Do get in touch if you would like to contribute something. We've got a stockpile of many experts and radio fans that we've recorded already, but always hunger for more. Join us next time as we embark on August of 1923. Well, most of it will stop just shy of the end of August because the Sykes inquiry concludes, simultaneous broadcasting starts, and they deserve an episode of their own. But next time, we've got some gardening, and Ireland gets a radio station, briefly, too. Do share the podcast, do subscribe, and do just tell someone about it. Drop them an email. Say, hey friend, remember me? I've got this podcast that you might like, the British Broadcasting Century. Give us a listen. And all that remains to say is, the British Broadcasting Century is presented and produced by me, Paul Carenza. All clips, as far as we know, are so old that they're far beyond copyright. Original music is by Will Farmer. And thank you so much to all of our patrons who have supported this podcast. Summer's Day, Greenbank Records, Chris Queen, Jerry Ralph, Desney Clark, Graham Brown, Hannah Fleming Hill, Steve Smallwood, Mark Allinson, Charlotte Connolly, Keith Marsh, Matt Lacey, Andrew Deacon, Neil Jackson, Andrew Jervis, Russ Anderson, David Jervis. No relation to Andrew Jervis. What are the chances? 2 Jervises. Robert Godfrey, Chris Tandrode, Sean Jacks, Adam Winstanley, John Hartman, Dave and Jackie, Sarah Noyd Mewers, James Morgan, Andrew Barker, Michelle Gersich, Roger Rainey and Adrian Pell. Those are our 29 stars. We thank them for their support. Do become our 30th to support the podcast. Patreon.com/Paul Carenza. And we also thank all of those who've supported on Patreon in the past. Without them, there's no this. Thank you. Join us next time then for August of 1923. Our guests Graham Stewart and Eddie Bowen as we look at Scottish and Irish broadcasting of the day. Informing, educating and entertaining. This has been and will continue to be the British Broadcasting Century.